Vanessa Navarro-Maza, and oh, nope, just kidding. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our second Cuba Hangout. My name is Vanessa Navarro-Maza, and I'm the folk life curator at the History Miami Museum and a proud CubaOne alum. I would like to thank Books and Books for hosting us today, and also our guest, Richard Blanco, for being here with us. On every first Friday from November through April, we'll be exploring relevant and popular Cuba-related topics during intimate conversations with a variety of fantastic speakers and members of our community. Our goal is to add meaningful content to a complicated and often misrepresented topic, Cuba and U.S.-Cuba relations. This ongoing series is brought to you by CubaOne and Cuba Educational Travel. The CubaOne Foundation offers a new generation of Cuban Americans the opportunity to give back to Cuba, build relationships with the Cuban people, and explore its heritage through high-impact trips to the island. Cuba Educational Travel is the leading organization in connecting the people of the U.S. and Cuba through travel. CET offers cultural, educational, and luxury travel to Cuba, working with clients to develop unique, customized, and curated experiences on the island. The organization works to improve U.S. policy towards Cuba and has brought countless political and economic delegations to the island as well. Our guest speaker today is Richard Blanco. Richard Blanco is the fifth presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history, the youngest, first Latino, immigrant, and gay person to serve in such a role. Born in Madrid to Cuban exiled parents and raised in Miami, the negotiation of cultural identity and place characterized his body of work. He is the author of four poetry collections, and the memoirs, The Prince of Los Cucuyos, A Miami Childhood, and For All of Us, One Today, An Inaugural Poet's Journey. He has also authored poetry chapbooks and a children's book of his inaugural poem, One Today. With Ruth Behar, he is the co-creator of the blog Bridges to and from Cuba, Lifting the Emotional Embargo, which provides a cultural and artistic platform for sharing the real lives and complex emotional histories of thousands of Cubans across the globe. Blanco has received various honors and awards, and in 2015, the Academy of American Poets named him its first education ambassador. He has continued to write occasional poems for organizations and events, such as the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Havana. Blanco is currently a distinguished visiting professor at Florida International University. So Richard, if we could start with having you introduce yourself and telling us a little bit about the many hats that you wear, right, not only as a poet and a writer, but also as an engineer and a professor.
Yeah, there's a lot of hats. Originally, I put them on and take them on and take them off and put them on and back on again. But I originally studied engineering, and that was my livelihood for many years. And then started studying and writing poetry. So for a while, I was engineer by day, poet by night, and that sort of continued for many years. Meanwhile, I've also explored memoir writing as well with the two memoirs. I've done that. So I'm a memoirist. I'm now thinking about exploring writing for TV and turning the memoir into a TV series. So that's another hat. I'm also, of course, I've been a professor here and there and taught visiting professors, sometimes full-time positions in between my engineering. I also attempted a master's in architecture at one point at 42, but I love it. I think I can't have it any other way. I'm not sure if I'm quite ADD, but something of that nature, because I love understanding all the interconnections and how knowledge actually, I think someday, if you dig deep enough, it's all connected and makes sense,
right,
and it all feeds each other. So.
So focusing in on your writer and poet hat,
all this cultural stuff, sometimes hating it, right? Because you're like, oh, I don't want to do quinces, and you're thinking, it's your parents, and so, but meanwhile, you're not realizing that you're really any different, especially in a place like Miami, where so many of the people, especially back in the 70s and 80s, were mostly Cuban, right? So you kind of grow up in this bubble, and you're not realizing that there are things imprinting you, questions that are being born in you that were born with you, right? About identity, place, connection. And I think there's a critical point at some point in your life, usually in your early 20s, where that big question is like, where am I from and where am I going? Like, you can't move forward till that question sort of pops in. And that's when you start going back through sifting through your own life. And hey, maybe those dumb stories about my parents in Cuba, maybe there was something to that. Maybe they are my stories. But I wouldn't have ordinarily dug into it as much if it weren't for writing itself. I started writing on a whim, started writing poetry like at 25 or so. And my first assignment at FIU by Campbell, my professor then, Campbell McGrath, was write a poem about America. And I went on like, what America? And so suddenly I realized I had all these questions and all this yearning and longing and blank spaces that I didn't know I had. So it was writing that led me to investigate that. And the more I investigated it, the more I wanted to write. And so the writing is an evolution of one's own personal journey, and then it's reflected in it. As I always like to say, writing makes you think, thinking makes you write, right? It goes hand in hand. And it's become the obsession of all my work. The idea of identity, of home, belonging in all its various dimensions and contexts has become it's the central obsession of my work. How do we know what home is? It's a big word. It's like asking what is love, and it's something that's not really, we can't really find a final answer, which makes it the product of art, because art is not necessarily about finding one singular answer, but about just keeping on asking really great questions.
Right. So similarly, in the way that your writing has kind of influenced the way that you thought about these things, how have your visits to Cuba impacted the ways that you view your identity and your sense of belonging to one or multiple places, and then how has that come out in your work?
Yeah, I'll try to condense it because it's been a ping pong effect. So growing up, as I said, it was kind of like I was like anti-Cuban because it's tacky and your parents are Cuban, and then I start writing, and then I have this, oh my God, I have to go to Cuba, of course. This is my heritage. This is I need to know this place. And then I became Mr. Cuba. And then I started sort of getting this anti-American, because then you start learning also the real history of the United States and all the La Maldicia, all the bad parts of history that they never taught you in grade school or high school for that matter. So then I became like Mr. Cuba, and I was like, I want to go live in Cuba someday. And I started sort of in a way, not advocating, but sort of trying to think, could there be some change? How can I do this through my work? How can I affect a dialogue? And that then I went to Cuba for the first time, of course, and I was like, wow, this opening up. But then I also at the same time realized, wait, there's this other half of me that is also unanswered, and that's America. So I actually moved because, back then, that was 94. The possibility of having a relationship with the island it's hard now. You can imagine back then, right? So then I was like, well, let me see if this America is really home, this America that's in my head. And I moved to Hartford, Connecticut.
That's where America is.
No. And that's when I soon realized that, that Brady Bunch America that I was looking for doesn't really exist. So then I was kind of like in a doldrum, right? And then when the White House, when Obama asked me to write an inaugural poem about this country, all those questions started to resurface again. Well, am I American? Am I supposed to be Peter Brady? This American narrative mine? Do I belong to this story? Do I love this country? That was a really big question I had to ask to be able to write the poem. Can I write am I as attached and loved, part of this country as much as I think I should be to be able to write an honest poem? So then I became Joe America. I was like, finally, I felt like I was finally Marsha Brady, and finally, in my own way, it was like the Blanco bunch instead of the Brady bunch. Because I realized that our stories have always been a grand part of the American narrative. Not the only part, but a grand part of it. Then relations opened up with Cuba. I get asked to read the poem over there, and then I'm like, now what? Because now I'm like, again, musing like, no, me compro una casita, buy a little house, maybe we can retire here. I can have a relationship with this island and its people that I need to catch up on. And what that experience taught me and shifted my whole thinking was I've started to think of myself as, up to that point, I still thought I had to pick or choose one or the other. And I started thinking myself at that moment more of a citizen of the world, which is, I think, where we are now globally. This idea that, that you belong to everything all at the same time, and one thing at one time if you like to too, and that you don't have to pick. You can move within those spaces as you feel you should. And these younger generations, some of my students, their dad's Bolivian, their grandmother's from China, and the world is becoming that kind of place where ethnic or cultural identity is becoming more complex, but also more cosmopolitan.
Right.
And that's where I'm trying to be now. Right.
Well, this might go in a different direction from that, but what makes you feel Cuban?
What makes me feel Cuban? I think that's a good question. I think partly is, of course, my family. That's a constant reminder, but it's a certain, I think it's just a certain je ne sais quoi. Well, no, that's not. I don't want to throw French here into the conversation, but it's the perspective of how we look at life that makes me feel Cuban. Just this tragic comic sense of life, how we are always laughing and crying. The perception of how we look at things makes me feel really Cuban, and I feel that most when I go to Cuba, because it's like, in a way, in Cuba, I stopped being Cuban. Or I could say what I mean is that I always say I love going to Cuba. I don't have to be Cuban anymore because I'm just Cuban. I don't have to think about being Cuban anymore. I'm not debating my cultural ethnicity, and you realize you really get into the flow of like, the joking and the thing, dicho, and that perspective to me is unique. And sometimes I really got to turn it on because I have too much of the sort of the more stoic American, busy. I'm busy, like perspective. I'm always busy. That makes me feel really Cuban. And pastelitos.
Always.
And food is just like I can't. That's why you call it comfort food. It's like I can't live without Cuban food. So, but yeah, I think it's that perspective that is pretty unique. I think even every culture has this unique perspective, and Cuba, that definitely for me reminds me. Like sometimes I'll look at something and I'm thinking about it in Cuban and I just crack up to myself like, Richard, you're no good, man.
Well, same question. What makes you feel American?
I mean, again, we can switch those hats, right? What makes me feel American, I think, is honestly, it's a really difficult question these days, but honestly, there's still this purest sort of sensibility and belief in this idea of freedom and democracy that I think is what carries my weight. I think it's what joins us all, right? Because I mean, America's the size of, it's practically a continent, right? In the United States. So, but to me, I always come back to, since I was a little kid, that hope, that dream of that ideal of a fair and equitable and society and democracy. I think it's something we are all struggling for as human beings, but that makes me feel really American. I still truly believe in those in those founding principles, because everything else is so varied and different. I really can't cling to anything else. Like you go to New York, it's one thing. You go to LA, it's another. But maybe that's what I like. Maybe that makes me feel very American too. That you can be many different things. But it's that, to me, it's that glue for me is that this is still a great social experiment, and I still truly believe in those words.
So now looking a little bit to what it's like to kind of grow up Cuban American, and I'm speaking specifically about the foreword that you wrote in Cuba Then, when you speak about the concept of memory, and if you could talk a little bit about the idea of inherited memories that aren't really yours, but feel like they're yours, and then how visiting Cuba and making your own memories has made you reconsider or consider these things.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of I think that's something that happens to all of us, right? Like I got here when I was 45 years old. I wasn't born in Cuba, but I was made in Cuba. My mother left 7 months pregnant, and I think, just biologically, I was absorbing all that in her womb, and then she left her entire family behind. It was just like really traumatic, as it was for many exiles. But I grew up, as I like to say, sort of in between two real imagined worlds, and one of those was America, but one of those was Cuba, this mythic Cuba. There was photographs and telegrams and letters and stories about my family, people I had never met. My mother had 8 brothers and sisters. But you grow up with hearing these things, or hearing little cuentos, like my grandmother talking about the tile floor that she used to have, or the things about the sugar mill, or these characters, and you grow up listening, and it becomes like, in a way, it becomes an inherited memory, almost like this idea of epigenetics that starts becoming part of your DNA. And to step into Cuba was like literally, I always say I went back to Cuba because it felt like I went back, and I got to walk through the same sugarcane fields that my dad cut, and hear the stories of so and so. They tell me about my father and my grandfather. I got to see that tile floor that's still there from my grandmother, and it's really interesting because of Cuba, preservation by decay. So many things haven't changed. And the cars are 1950s, so it's really like blows your mind, because you really feel like you stepped into a time machine, and all those memories, you're reliving them. And it's really it was really amazing and complex and emotional experience. So that continues to happen even today. I still, I've gone so many times that I've caught up, but there's still a little bit. What was the second part of that? Because I was thinking.
Well, it was, you answered it. Is how is visiting and making your own memories of Cuba?
What I wanted to say now, I've gotten to the point where I've realized that no matter how much I thought I was seeing the real Cuba or engaging with Cuba as a I had realized that I was still living in the memory of my parents, and I was still realizing that I was living in a Cuba that doesn't exist, or that I was going to a Cuba that really didn't exist, right? And after and I've always gone to see family. In the last 3 trips, one being with CubaOne, I've gone as an artist, I've gone as a writer and a poet, and I've started to see the next layer of Cuba, which is the Cuba of 60 years later, that's had its own history, its own evolution, its own aesthetics, its own problems, its own. And starting that, I'm realizing, I don't know that if I'm going to claim this someday, reclaim my Cuban heritage, I've got to do some homework, and I have to pay my respects to these people on the island, and realize that I need to get to know this island on another level, not just through memory. That was great, but these are real people in real time now, and Cuba is a real place in real time.
I can absolutely relate to that. Let me see. So I think that we're just in time to take questions from the audience. No, we're not. So you started speaking about this a little bit, but how did your preparation and performance of the poem "One Today," the poem you wrote for Obama's inauguration ceremony, influence your understanding of American identity, and especially like the performance aspect of it?
Well, it's kind of the poem was, in a way, I had 1 week to write the poem, so you're just writing, you're not thinking so much. I was asking those big questions, and it was, if I belong to this American family. It was actually the tragedy of Sandy Hook, the shooting of Sandy Hook, that connected me to America emotionally, right as I was trying to write the poem. That's why the kids are in the poem in memoriam. But it really, you're just, it's 6 weeks from the time you get the phone call, or 8 weeks to the time you're up at that podium reading a poem to 40 million people. And as I'm sitting there waiting to be called up to the podium, it was the first time I had actually had a moment. I wasn't doing interviews or writing the poem or like buying clothes for all these events. And it just hit me, and I turned to my mom, and I said, "Mom, I guess we're finally Americanos." So I guess this is it. This is what we've been waiting for. And it was at that moment that I realized what the poem was really doing was still asking the same question of home, right? It's like, who, but not just for me, but thinking about home for all of us, and thinking, how are we all connected? And that's when I kind of realized that I think I became, to myself, an American at that point. I was like, you know what? Regardless, even though our histories have been marginalized and ignored and prejudiced and we know the whole ugly history of the United States, we're still part of the fabric of that narrative, and I have every right to claim that narrative. And I realized I didn't have to be Peter or Marsha Brady for real. Like, part of me still felt, a little part of me still felt I needed to do that. So the poem itself, as I look back in the poem, as we say in poetry, a poem is in a way, the poet having a conversation with himself, him or herself, as others listen, right? And in that poem, I wanted us all to come home. I wanted us all to sit around the proverbial table and sort of also embrace that idea, but also realizing that we're not one yet, that we still have a lot of work to do. So the poem is also its tension. So yeah.
Similar question. We're ready for a question. Who do we have? Is that Luis? Hi, Luis. I think we could hear you if you want to ask your question.
Sure. Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Hi, Richard. This has been awesome watching. So much of what you've been mentioning, so much what you've been saying, really resonates.
Sure.
And so this has been really exciting to watch you guys. I have a quick question. I know you mentioned a bit about growing up, and you mentioned a bit about your personal experience kind of developing with the island and as you grow into this new identity. But can you speak about your experience growing up in the Cuban exile community in Miami, particularly as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and how perhaps this has influenced you as a person, but also how it's influenced the work that you produce?
Sure. I think on one level, I've written some essays about this, and it's ironic that I most of my poetry is apolitical, because I grew up in a very politicized and polarized climate, and I think that at an early age I realized that truth is usually somewhere in the gray, because you have the history books or the textbooks at school, and they're like Kennedy this and Kennedy that, and like Kennedy Boulevard. Is there even a Kennedy Boulevard in Miami? And then you get home and there's another story, and like that with so many things. Or in the community, there was another story, and how different perspectives. And I'm just talking to sort of the Anglo-Americans that had a whole different perspective of what Cuba was or what the history was. And so I learned at an early age that to look for the middle, to look for the gray. And I think in my writing, what I wanted to do was to tell the stories, period, end of story. I didn't want to over politicize the stories, because there was enough of that. And as I like to think of myself as an emotional historian, both the stories of my family, of the exile community, they are an inspiration to me. They made me who I am. I was raised by them. But also the stories of my counterparts in Cuba, my uncles and my aunts, those stories are valid too. Again, not on a political front, but how are we all affected by the crossroads or the crossfire of history, or the crossroads of history itself? So that's been important. As far as LGBT is concerned, like that acronym didn't even exist when I was growing up. So that was just a whole other layer that came later in my life. But what I did realize later in my writing, and I didn't really come out in my poetry, or didn't tell the story of being gay till my third book, because I realized that was also connected to a sense of home that comes also from this idea of not home, and I'm going to Cuba, but home in terms of safe space, and realizing something that I call cultural sexuality, realizing I'm not like those gay guys in Provincetown, right? Like there's something different about me, and that's my story. And then that's when I started writing about it, that what I call cultural sexuality, or the intersectionality of, it's not the same thing to be a Cuban gay kid who grew up in Miami behind Bird Bowl than it is to be an Asian American kid who grew up in Kansas behind a dry cleaner, right? And those are the stories that are those unique stories. And so thinking about, of course, how that means machismo, how that means all these other nuances about different things that as a Cuban gay man you have to, and as a Latino gay man, you have to sort of contend with, that are different than other people. And I think we need to share those stories, because there isn't one LGBTQ person, in the world. And I think those stories are starting to come out now, obviously more and more, right? But I think that was something in retrospect that I realized that was the story, that my uniqueness, my unique story was not just about being gay, but also being gay and Cuban, and how those things intersect, and that you can't separate those two things, right?
Thanks so much for your question, Luis.
Thank you, guys.
I see we have another person who wants to ask a question. If you want to introduce yourself and tell us where you are and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Lisette Poole. I'm a photographer. I'm here in Havana. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Hi. It's been really great hearing you, Richard. Nice to electronically meet you on Google Hangouts. I really like a lot of what you said, and of course relate a lot to identity. I am Cuban American as well, but I grew up in California, so very far from most of the Cuban diaspora. And I've been based in Havana for 4 years now, and I found that growing up in the United States, I was allowed to say that I was Cuban, and then coming to Cuba, I actually wasn't allowed to say that I was Cuban anymore. I was just American. And so, or not just American, like the whole story had to be part of that, you know, my answer to that question. And reading some of your work, I was actually curious about translation, because I find that for me, being bilingual is a huge part of what I do. I'm a photographer, but I'm working on my first book and writing right now. And, you know, as I see in your poem, Translation for Mama, for example, there are certain words that you just can't translate into English. So even in the English version, you keep them in Spanish. And I'm wondering how you sort of reconcile, like, who is your audience when you're writing? Who are you thinking about? And how do you reconcile the fact that, you know, words obviously exist in a certain time and place. They exist sort of in our hearts, and those meanings carry so much weight. Like, how do you make sure that your audience actually gets what you're trying to say? Or yeah, I'm just wondering sort of what your process is with that.
Yeah, the negotiation of all languages when it comes to the writing poetry and writing even the memoir, really, and how you negotiate all those spaces, all those nuances of language. I've evolved through that in different things and different ways I've handled it or thought about it. Well, to answer your first question, my audience, I assume my audience is a monolingual reader, because at the end of the day, I am an American poet, right? I cannot claim to be a Cuban poet. I don't have that. I didn't live in Cuba. I don't have that history. I don't have the same literary tradition. You know, so while there's, of course, art transcends and art is, you know, universal, and it's, and, you know, there's connections across culture through art, of course. But, you know, I belong to the language of Whitman, and that's the language I have to write in, right? That's the language I was educated in. I can't talk about post-colonial literature in Spanish. So what I've realized lately is that all my work in English is actually a translation of a life that happened in Spanish. So it's already a translation. And then my translator, the third book of poetry was translated, and he was Cuban. And he said, "What did your mother really say?" Because we dawned on this idea that actually I had translated all this stuff that happens in the poems, family poems mostly, right? It happened in Spanish. So the Spanish parts, I would use things that were more friendly or that could be understood in context for a monolingual reader. But I also just use it as a poetic device, right? If someone is filming a movie about an Italian family, even though the movie is in English, there's going to be sound bites of people talking Italian, right? And that's perfectly part of what the craft demands, putting Spanish in there. And mostly the stuff that I can't translate, like I can't say aunt in my poems, like what is that? You have to say dia, or or granny. Like I don't think I've ever used the word granny in any like capacity whatsoever in my entire life, except right now. So there are words that I refuse to translate. So the translation was a reverse translation of putting that life back in its original language. So there was more cussing involved, there was more screaming, there was how it really happened, right? And then so what happens to me when I go to Cuba is fascinating. At the beginning, I usually gone mostly with my mother, and at the beginning I'm just like, "Mom, how do you say this in Spanish? How do you say this in Spanish? How do you say this in Spanish?" And then there's a moment where my mind just gets tired of translating, and it shuts down. And I have no language for like a couple hours. Like I'll just look at a tree and there'll be no word in my head. And then something switches and I start thinking in Spanish, and I start forgetting English, which is scary too. And then I have to start asking my mother, like, "How do you say that in English?" Because I start forgetting my English. And I love that happens. I love that's crazy. But you're right, in context of living in Cuba, that's one thing that that it takes me like 3 days, and then it's through language that I can feel I can finally connect, right, and tell that whole story, because you're Cuban, but you're not Cuban. It's more complicated, right? So that's kind of how I negotiate stuff. In that poem translation for Mama, what I like to do with my work, it's not a literal translation. In other words, I co-create the poem in 2 languages at the same time. So I'll start writing in Spanish. Usually when I go to Cuba, I start thinking in Spanish. So I start getting inspired in Spanish first. And then I start writing a line in Spanish or 2, and then I translate it into English, change it into English, because it's my work, to see how it works better in English, reverse translate it to Spanish, change to Spanish, translate it again, and I keep on doing this back and forth until I feel I've said what I wanted to say the best way I could in both languages at the same time, which is in a way what a bilingual mind tries to do all the time, right? We're always filling in words when there is no other word for something else, both in Spanish and also, there are things in English, there are beautiful words in English can describe things that no one in Spanish can. So I love playing with all that, because it's textual, and it's about craft, but it's also about the very being of how I think and feel. Like sometimes I get so tired of speaking English, especially when I'm up north, that someone else just start talking to me, my mind will go right to Pepe Peña, and I'll just be like, I'll just start dissing the guy in my head in Spanish or something. The guy has no idea what's going on, and I'm like, because my mind just does not want to do English anymore. I'm done with English. I need some Spanish and a pastelito.
That happens to me too. Thank you so much, Lisette, for your question.
Yes,
and Luis, I'm sorry, I realized that I didn't give you a chance to introduce yourself. If you want to introduce yourself and tell us where you are.
Sure, yes. My name is Luis Quijano, and I am currently in Chicago. I've been spending the last year in Brazil on a Fulbright, and I'm going back to Miami next week. So I'm kind of all over, also, forming that identity that you talked about. And I'm now assisting with CubaOne, helping them with community engagement and some special gifts, and really trying to help and support and expand the programming that CubaOne does, and also these types of Google Hangouts that I think are essential just to keep us in touch with the island. We can't be there every day, and we like to know other people's experiences and be able to relate with those experiences. So everything, again, I really appreciate this Hangout, because I was able to think about my own experience, and here I am, my creative switch is once again on. So thank you both so much for putting this together.
Absolutely.
Thank you both.
Yes, thank you, Lisette and Luis.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Richard Blanco for being here with us today. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to Books and Books for hosting us. Please join us for our next Hangout session with author and retired U.S. Ambassador Vicki Huddleston on January 4th at 3:05. Thanks.